A black doctor, exhausted after a 12-hour shift saving lives, walks into an upscale restaurant, ready to enjoy a well-deserved meal. But before he can even sit down, a waitress, dripping with condescension, questions whether he belongs. The humiliation is public, the assumptions clear. Just 3 minutes later, the restaurant manager walks over. What happens next shocks the entire room and sets off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. If you find this story important, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening stories that mainstream media won't tell you. It started as just another evening. Airports are places of transition. They are designed for movement, for passing through, for existing temporarily before one is carried off to somewhere else. And yet, even in the in-between, the old rules remain. Captain Olivia Carter knew this well. She had spent years in the sky, crossing borders, navigating the impossible, commanding machines that defied gravity itself. But gravity, she had learned, was not always the strongest force at play. Assumptions, expectations, those weighed heavier than any aircraft she had ever flown. She walked through the terminal with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years proving herself. It was in her posture, in the way she carried her navy blue blazer over her arm, the way she rolled her carry-on with steady precision. And yet, when she reached the first-class gate, the moment she stepped into the line marked for priority boarding, something shifted. It was subtle, at first, a glance too long, a pause too heavy. The gate agent, a young man with a professional smile, flicked his eyes from her face to her ticket, back to her face again. She had seen this moment before, lived it more times than she cared to count. The hesitation, the unspoken question. "Are you sure you belong here? Is this your flight?" he asked. His voice carefully neutral. Olivia didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes, didn't let her shoulders sag beneath the weight of the moment. She simply handed over her boarding pass. "It is." A beat. The scanner beeped. The machine did not hesitate. Nor did it question. The light flashed green. She was cleared. The young man forced a smile. "Enjoy your flight." She nodded, stepping through. Even now, even here, the ritual has not changed. It was always the same. A challenge followed by permission. Inside the first-class cabin, the air was thick with something unspoken. A different kind of gravity. Olivia knew before she even sat down that she had already become a point of curiosity. An unanswered question in a room full of people who assumed the answer was obvious. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment, settled into her seat, and waited. The test had only just begun. There are things a person grows used to. Not because they should, but because to do otherwise would be exhausting. Captain Olivia Carter had grown used to the space between suspicion and politeness. The way a room could welcome her and challenge her in the same breath. First class was no different. She had barely settled into her seat when she felt it. The eyes, not all at once, not obvious enough to call out, but in stolen glances, in the quick dart of pupils pretending not to see what they could not ignore. Across the aisle, a man in a neatly pressed suit adjusted his tie, stealing a glance her way. A middle-aged woman, clutching a designer handbag, shifted in her seat as if Olivia's presence had somehow made the space smaller. And then, of course, there was the flight attendant. Rachel, blonde, composed, practiced, the kind of person who had been trained to smile while keeping certain doors shut. She appeared at Olivia's side with the forced cheer of someone trying to soften an edge that did not need softening. "Ma'am, I just want to confirm. This is first class." It was not a question. It was not a statement. It was a test. Olivia had passed through enough doors to recognize it for what it was. She looked up at Rachel. Unbothered. "I know." Rachel hesitated, the smile flickering, just for a moment, just enough for Olivia to catch it. "Oh, of course. My mistake." She stepped back, but not before glancing toward the younger flight attendant a few seats away. A whisper, a chuckle, a knowing look exchanged like a private joke. Olivia exhaled through her nose. This was the game, not outright refusal. That would be too obvious. Too crude. It was always something smaller. Something softer. A delayed service. A raised eyebrow. A hesitation that only existed when people like her were involved. It was the price of admission. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, stealing another glance before looking away, pretending he hadn't just watched the entire exchange. She had seen his type before, comfortable in the way the world bent around him, but curious now, as if seeing something unfamiliar in his own reflection. The woman with the designer handbag stirred her coffee, then turned toward Olivia with a polite smile. So, are you traveling for business? There it was, the polite way of asking. Why are you here? Olivia considered the question for a moment, then met the woman's gaze. No. A beat. The woman nodded slowly, waiting for more. None came. She looked down at her coffee, her lips tightening. Silence settled over the cabin again. But it was not restful. It was the kind of silence that begged to be filled. With an explanation, with an apology, with an answer to a question Olivia had no intention of answering. She turned her head toward the window, watching the city disappear beneath them as the plane lifted into the sky. She had been tested, and she had decided not to play. There is a way these things go. A rhythm to them. First, the glances, fleeting but deliberate, as if the mind could not quite process what the eyes were seeing. Then, the questions, soft, polite, carefully wrapped in curiosity but laced with something heavier. And finally, the verdict, a silent decision made in the space between two people. One who must justify their presence and one who has never had to. Captain Olivia Carter had seen it unfold too many times to count. And yet, each time, there was something fresh about the insult. As if the world had found a new way to remind her that it had not yet decided what to do with a woman like her. The flight had settled into its quiet hum of luxury. Drinks were served, voices were lowered, the small movements of privilege carried on as they always did. Olivia had just begun to let herself sink into the moment when Rachel returned. This time with a tray of drinks balanced effortlessly in her hand. Would you care for a beverage? The question was routine, almost robotic. Olivia reached for the champagne flute, her fingers brushing the delicate stem, only for Rachel to pull back. Just slightly, just enough for it to be noticeable. We have other options, Rachel said, smiling too wide, too falsely. If this isn't quite your taste, I can bring you something from Coach. Olivia froze for half a second. Half a second too long. That was part of it, too. The expectation that she would hesitate. That she would be caught off guard. That the moment would pass without acknowledgement. She lifted her gaze to Rachel's. Calm, steady. This will do. Rachel's smile flickered. A small thing, barely visible, but Olivia saw it. And just like that, the moment was over. The champagne was placed before her. And Rachel moved on. But Olivia could feel the shift. The attention. The way the woman across the aisle stirred her coffee a little too slowly now. The way the businessman in the suit kept adjusting his tie. People were listening, watching. It wasn't the act itself. It never was. It was the understanding that something had just happened. That a line had been drawn in the sand. And that Olivia had refused to step back. She lifted the glass to her lips and took a slow sip. The bubbles fizzed on her tongue. Crisp and expensive. But the taste was irrelevant. The real test had already begun. And Olivia Carter had already passed. There was something theatrical about it. The way people played their parts so seamlessly. The way the script had been rehearsed without ever being spoken aloud. The actors in this particular performance were well practiced. The flight attendants with their saccharine smiles and well-placed hesitations. The businessmen with their knowing glances. The woman across the aisle with her carefully worded questions. And then, of course, there was Olivia Carter. She had been cast in this play before. But unlike the others, she had never auditioned. She leaned back into her seat, the champagne untouched on her tray, her fingers tapping absently against the armrest. The flight moved smoothly through the sky, the quiet murmur of conversation filling the cabin. Rachel had disappeared toward the galley. But Olivia knew she would return. She always did. A few minutes later, Rachel was back, moving through the aisle with the precision of someone who had mastered the art of pretending. She leaned down toward an older couple across from Olivia, her voice just loud enough to be overheard. Let me know if there's anything else I can do for you. We want to make sure our first-class passengers feel comfortable. There it was. The message, delivered without ever being addressed to her. The reminder that comfort was not a universal right but a privilege extended to some and revoked from others. Olivia turned her head slightly, watching Rachel out of the corner of her eye. She had played this game before. Rachel moved down the aisle, stopping just short of Olivia's seat. Is everything to your liking? The words were polite, but the tone was not. Olivia smiled, slow, deliberate. That depends. Rachel blinked. On what? On whether or not you were asking me or informing the rest of the cabin that I should be grateful to be here. The air shifted. A few seats away, the businessman adjusted his tie again. The woman across the aisle looked down at her coffee, her fingers tightening around the porcelain cup. Rachel's expression faltered for a fraction of a second. She started, but Olivia had already turned her head back toward the window, dismissing her without another word. Rachel straightened, clearing her throat before moving down the aisle. Her steps a little too quick, a little too controlled. The woman across from Olivia finally lifted her gaze, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. That was quite the response, she said, her voice careful. Olivia took a slow breath, then met the woman's gaze directly. No, she corrected, her voice smooth, steady. That was quite the question. Silence settled over the cabin again, thick and lingering. The game had changed, and everyone knew it. There is something suffocating about silence, particularly when it follows an unspoken challenge. It is not empty, it is thick, weighted, alive with the things people want to say but don't. The things they whisper only when they believe the right ears will hear them. Olivia Carter had spent her life listening to this kind of silence. It was the silence that followed a promotion others believed she hadn't earned. The silence that hung in a room after she introduced herself as Captain Carter and saw the flicker of disbelief in their eyes. The silence that settled over first class whenever someone like Rachel had their assumptions shattered. The plane moved steadily through the sky, the hum of the engines filling the space where conversation used to be. Olivia sipped her champagne, unbothered. She had never asked for comfort. She had only asked to exist without contest. Rachel had not returned since their last exchange, but Olivia knew she would. There was a certain type of person who could not sit with discomfort. They needed to smooth things over, not because they wanted peace, but because they wanted the illusion of it. And so, when Rachel finally approached again, Olivia was not surprised. The smile was back in place. But something was different now. It was no longer effortless. It was forced, stretched just a little too thin. Captain Carter, Rachel said, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness that is meant to sound like respect but often carries something else entirely. I hope you're enjoying your flight. Olivia set her glass down carefully, tilting her head slightly. I would be, she said, if I didn't have to spend half of it proving I belong here. Rachel blinked. A few seats away, the businessman had frozen in place, his fingers resting against the screen of his tablet but no longer scrolling. The woman across the aisle had stopped stirring her coffee. Olivia could feel the moment stretching, pulling at the seams of the careful order Rachel had tried to maintain. I'm sorry if I gave you that impression, Rachel said, choosing her words carefully, as if each one might betray her if she wasn't precise. Olivia smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. You didn't give me the impression. She lifted her glass again, taking a slow sip before continuing. You gave the entire cabin the impression. Rachel exhaled through her nose, her grip tightening slightly around the tray she held. That wasn't my intention. Ah, Olivia murmured, nodding. But intent and impact rarely align. Do they? Silence again. Rachel swallowed, the first real crack in her performance. She could have walked away, could have nodded and retreated to the safety of the galley. But she didn't, because people like Rachel did not walk away. They fixed things. They ensured that no one, not even the ones they had slighted, would be able to say, I was wronged. And so, she stayed. I hope, Rachel said after a moment, her voice quieter now, that you'll let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable. Olivia tilted her head. You can start, she said, By thinking about why you felt the need to say that in the first place. Rachel parted her lips slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. And then, slowly, she nodded. She turned and walked away. Her steps no longer as confident, no longer as certain. Olivia watched her go, then turned back to the window, gazing out at the sky stretching endlessly before her. For the first time since takeoff, the silence felt lighter. There is a contract in spaces like these. It is not written down, nor is it spoken aloud, but it exists. It exists in the polite nods exchanged between certain passengers, in the quiet way people assume their places, in the careful balancing act of luxury and exclusion. Captain Olivia Carter had seen this contract enforced in ways both subtle and brutal. It did not require laws. It did not require orders. It simply required participation, the silent agreement that some belonged, and others needed to explain why they were there. She had refused to participate. And now, she was being watched. It was not overt. No one was staring outright. No one was foolish enough to be obvious. But she could feel it. The sideways glances, the stolen looks, the way conversations faltered when she met someone's gaze. The businessman across the aisle had stopped pretending to read his tablet. The woman who had questioned her earlier now seemed to be studying her, as if she had become something to be understood rather than dismissed. Rachel, who had not returned since their last exchange, moved through the cabin with a carefulness she had not needed before. The contract had been broken, and that made Olivia dangerous. She sat back in her seat, exhaling slowly, the tension in the air thickening like storm clouds gathering just beyond the horizon. Then, the plane jolted. A small thing, a tremor that barely registered to most passengers. But Olivia had spent too many hours in the cockpit not to recognize the difference between routine turbulence and something else. Another jolt, this time, sharper. The engines droned on, steady but strained. Olivia sat up straighter. Her fingers, on instinct, tightened against the armrest. She glanced toward the flight attendants, watching for the moment when professionalism slipped, when routine turned into recognition of a problem. And there it was. Lisa, the younger flight attendant, whispering something to Rachel. The stiffness in Rachel's posture, the way her fingers curled ever so slightly into fists. A third jolt, harder this time. The businessman across from Olivia cursed under his breath. The intercom crackled, but it was not the captain's voice that came through. It was the first officer. Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened. Olivia's stomach tightened. She knew that voice. She had trained pilots who sounded like that. It was the voice of a man trying not to let his fear slip through the cracks. Something was wrong. Rachel passed by quickly, avoiding eye contact. Olivia watched her go, then unbuckled her seatbelt. Lisa, seeing her movement, rushed forward. Ma'am, please remain seated. Quote. Olivia turned her head slowly, locking eyes with her. Something's wrong in the cockpit. Lisa hesitated. I need to speak to the flight crew, Olivia said, her voice even, controlled. Now. Lisa's lips parted slightly, uncertainty flashing across her face. Rachel, appearing behind her, did not hesitate. Absolutely not, she said, her voice sharp. You need to sit down. Olivia met her gaze, unblinking. I am Captain Olivia Carter, she said, her voice low but firm. I have more flight hours than the man currently struggling to keep this plane steady. Now, you can either move, or you can explain to the passengers why you refuse to let the only person who can help through that door. Silence. The businessman exhaled sharply. The woman across the aisle gripped her armrest. Rachel did not move. Another sharp jolt rocked the plane. Lisa swallowed hard. Then, before Rachel could stop her, turned and rushed toward the cockpit. Rachel stood still, her jaw clenched, her hands shaking at her sides. She had spent this entire flight trying to remind Olivia that she did not belong. And now, the only person who could land this plane was the woman she had tried to keep out. The contract had been broken. And now, there were no rules left to follow. There is a moment, in every crisis, where time slows. It is not hesitation, not fear, but the mind's quiet recognition that whatever happens next will be irreversible. For Captain Olivia Carter, that moment came as she stepped past Rachel, her feet steady despite the way the plane trembled beneath them. The cockpit door loomed ahead. Lisa stood there, her expression torn between duty and something deeper. Something unspoken. She had spent this flight watching Olivia. Watching the way she had been tested. Dismissed. Forced to justify herself. And now, Lisa held the power to decide whether that dismissal would continue or if, for once, Olivia would be recognized for who she was. Rachel was still behind her. She is not authorized. Quote. She is the only one who can fix this. Lisa interrupted, her voice sharper than before. Rachel flinched. Another jolt. The plane dipped, this time more violently. Someone screamed from the cabin. The moment shattered. Lisa pressed the button, and the lock on the cockpit door released with a click. Olivia stepped through. Inside, the cockpit was chaotic. The first officer sat stiffly in his seat, sweat beading at his temple. The captain, an older man, his face pale, was slumped against the controls. Unconscious. A light blinked erratically on the dashboard. The plane was losing stability. Olivia exhaled slowly. What happened? The first officer turned, eyes wide. He was young, no older than 30, his hands shaking slightly against the yoke. He said he wasn't feeling well. Then he just collapsed. Olivia nodded, already scanning the instruments. She understood now why the turbulence had felt wrong. It wasn't just the wind. It was the slow, uneven adjustments being made by a man who was no longer capable of flying the plane. She slid into the captain's seat. The leather was still warm. Take a breath, she told the first officer. He did, shaky, but he did. We're going to stabilize first. Then we'll reroute for an emergency landing. Are you ready? He swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. She reached for the controls. The moment her hands touched them, everything changed. The hum of the plane, the tremors, the weight of the eyes watching from the cabin. None of it mattered now. She was home. The plane steadied under her command. The first officer followed her lead, his movements growing surer as they worked in tandem. Olivia adjusted the altitude, recalibrated the autopilot. The violent dips smoothed. The intercom crackled. Lisa's voice, Captain Carter. The passengers, quote, patch me through, Olivia said. A pause. Then, a soft beep. She took a breath. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Olivia Carter speaking. The silence on the other end was instant. We are currently rerouting for an emergency landing. I want to assure you that the situation is under control. She paused, glancing at the first officer. His grip on the controls was steadier now. His breath even. I know some of you may be frightened. She continued, but I have thousands of hours in the air. And I have trained for moments like this. We will land safely. A tremor passed through the cabin. But this time, it was not the plane. It was the weight of realization. She imagined the businessman gripping his armrest. The woman across the aisle lowering her coffee cup. Rachel standing stiffly near the galley. Her carefully constructed world slipping through her fingers. They had spent this flight deciding whether Olivia belonged. And now, they would place their lives in her hands. There was no test left to give. She had already won. The descent began. The airport came into view. A stretch of tarmac bathed in early morning light. Flaps down, Olivia ordered. The first officer compiled without hesitation. The wheels touched the ground with a smooth, practiced ease. The plane slowed. The danger passed. Applause broke out in the cabin. Not polite, not performative, real. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The first officer turned to her. His expression unreadable. Then, quietly, he said, "Thank you." Olivia nodded. She had not done this for gratitude. She had done it because she was the best. And now, they all knew it. The plane had landed, but the moment had not passed. Captain Olivia Carter sat in the cockpit for a beat longer than necessary, listening to the breathless relief beyond the reinforced door. There was something poetic about it. A plane full of passengers who had spent the flight questioning whether she belonged were now only safe because she had been there. And yet, she knew how this would go. She had seen it before. They would disembark with quick steps. shaking their heads, pressing their phones to their ears. They would tell the story. But not all of it. We had an emergency landing. But it was fine. The captain collapsed. But everything worked out. They would strip it of context, of meaning. Because to tell the full story would mean confronting something deeper. Something uglier. That the woman they had doubted. The woman who had been subtly, and not so subtly, told she did not belong. Had been the only thing standing between them and disaster. That their instincts, their small assumptions, their careful exclusions, had been wrong. The door opened. Lisa stood there, looking at Olivia like she was seeing her for the first time. Perhaps she was. Captain Carter, she said, her voice careful. Yes? They're waiting for you. Olivia stood. The walk through the cabin was different now. The businessman who had spent the flight sneaking glances at her now looked at her fully. A quiet shame behind his eyes. The woman across the aisle, the one who had studied her like an anomaly, clutched her purse tightly, as if holding onto something familiar in a world that no longer made sense. Rachel stood near the exit. Her hands clasped together. She opened her mouth, closed it. Captain Carter. Olivia met her gaze. I hope you learned something today. Rachel swallowed. There were apologies. And then there were reckonings. And this, Olivia decided, would be the latter. She turned and stepped off the plane. Outside, the airport was alive with flashing lights and rushing personnel. Paramedics climbed aboard, heading for the unconscious captain. The first officer lingered at the steps, running a shaking hand through his hair. You saved us, he said. I did my job. He exhaled a laugh, but there was something heavy behind it. They'll never forget this. Olivia looked past him, watching the first passengers step off the plane. Oh, she said, they'll try. The businessman would tell his version of the story over dinner. But he would leave out the part where he doubted the pilot before she saved his life. The woman across the aisle would recount it to friends. But she would not mention that she had spent the flight deciding whether Olivia was really a pilot. Rachel would tuck it away. Bury it deep beneath professionalism and routine. But something in her had shifted. And Olivia knew it. There would be another flight. Another woman like Olivia. And when that day came, perhaps Rachel would pause before questioning whether she belonged. Perhaps. She stepped through the crowd, past reporters pressing microphones toward the dazed first officer. They didn't come to her. Didn't ask for the real story. They never did. And that was fine. Because Olivia had already told it. Not in words. Not in speeches. But in the way she had touched the controls. In the way she had steadied the descent. In the way she had reminded them. Every last one of them. That she had been the answer all along. She hailed a car. As it pulled away from the terminal, she exhaled slowly, letting the weight of it settle. She had spent her entire life proving she belonged. Today, she did something great. She had made them question why they ever thought otherwise.